There's Scott. Is he here too?
Oh, hey, banter right before. Let's play the music.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Football Weather. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield, Matt Blaska. I'm all discombobulated as we start this podcast. We had a little technical issue. You got some talking at the beginning of the pod. You got the wrong video playing at the start. I had to go back and start over again. The glamorous life of podcasting in the 21st century. Matt, good to see you. I'm glad I didn't wear my Washington hoodie. I have that exact same one. How you doing?
I am good. I put this on since we're talking Big Ten today. I was going to go IU, but I was like, let's just go something different. So I went with the Huskies, and I bought this for Penix 2 years ago.
Yes,
but I still love the hoodie. It's a great look.
I often think Washington might have, I don't know, it's not the best color scheme, but it might be a top 10 color scheme in college football. I mean, just because it's like, love purple in general. I think purple's an underutilized color. Gold with purple is a classic look. And then there's enough variations that you feel like it's always a good combo, regardless of what it is. And I really do. I like that. I'm wearing the SMU t-shirt today. You've got the Washington hoodie. You're a lot more conference appropriate than I am in this one, but it's nice to see that. It's nice to see you. It's good to be back talking about football here.
Always a pleasure. And I was, thinking since we're always talking weather, it seems like we always have something. And that we are called football weather. What is the most unusual football weather you sat through?
That's a great question. Well, so if I have to have actually been out in the elements, there's two games that come to mind. One of them was actually an old Oak and Bucket game, Indiana versus Purdue in Memorial Stadium in 2001. I had graduated, and of course we didn't beat Purdue any of the 4 years that I was in school. But I drove down because I had some friends. David Pierce, I think I stayed at his place the night before because he was still in school. David's a friend of both of ours. And I go to the game the next day with Kevin Gray, a friend of mine, still a friend of mine. And it was not a well-attended game because IU, even though they'd had a really good season by IU standards at that point, they'd won at Wisconsin like 63-32, and they'd beaten Michigan State. And you're like, wow, they must have gone to a bowl. They didn't go to a bowl that year, but it was Antoine Randall's senior year. And that game, it dawned, and it was a relatively warm day by November standards. It was that Saturday after Thanksgiving. And then the rain came, and it was so hard and so heavy that it was literally raining sideways in the stadium. I was over I guess I would have been in the East Main, just getting absolutely pelted, absolutely drenched by this monsoon-like condition. Now, we're used to that with like hurricane type of weather. We've been in a couple of those, but that was it was truly horrific. The nice thing was Indiana won the game. Got down on the field. We tore a goalpost down. I think that might have been the last goalpost that got torn down in Memorial Stadium. Maybe the one in 2007. I don't actually remember that. But yeah, it's either that or there was a game I went to. You might have gone to this game too. Again, it was an Indiana game, but it was Indiana, Iowa in like 2011 or 2012. No. And it was like sleet raining. It was too cold for the precipitation coming down. And it just was like brutally bad in those conditions. The tailgate was awful. I don't remember the game being particularly enjoyable either. So all of mine have been rain related. I haven't had we had the snow globe game obviously last year with Indiana Purdue. That was certainly unique in a great way. What about you?
Yeah, I didn't go to the last game last year. I was away, but I was at a Jets game in 2003 where it was snowing and we weren't going to go, but I was like, let's just go. Never been to a snow game. I was 18 at the time or 17. And so we drove up. It snowed the entire game. Curtis Martin ran for like 200 and some yards. Jets won 6-0. I'll never forget it. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was a touchdown they scored. I don't think they kicked a field goal. But it was just snow, and it took us like 5 hours to get home. I'll never forget, like, my dad go, why are we here? I'm like, We wanted to go to a snow game, so we came out here in the middle of the Meadowlands, and it was a fun game to watch, but it was a miserable experience.
I will say the most miserable pre-game weather I've ever been at was the last home game of the 2019 season. And if you remember, like Indiana, that was the year that they went 8-5. They went to the Gator Bowl. They ended up losing that game, but they'd beaten Nebraska on the road, and they beat Northwestern handily, and they'd cinched a bowl, and everything looked like it was going. And they had Michigan, and it was a long day, and the tailgate. It was not just cold, but it was like just warm enough that it was raining. You remember this game very well, and it was so like there's something about cold rain that just brutalizes you physically. I remember my youngest daughter was, I think, still maybe like 10 months old at that point, or maybe she was about a year and 10 months. But my wife brought her to the tailgate, and she just screamed the whole time, to the point that she had to take her home, and she screamed the whole car ride home. I had made the mistake of selling. Someone had given me a tailgate pass to sell, but it was like the RV lot at the corner of 17th and Fee, and I had to walk there from the green lot. And I got so cold and so drenched from the walk over there to collect the money and hand off the pass. I had to come back, sit in my vehicle, turn up the heat full blast, and just sit there for 20 minutes just to thaw out enough. And then, of course, Indiana got destroyed in that game. It was a really, that was like, oh, surely we're going to go through all of this, and there's going to be some pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Didn't happen.
I remember I went to that game that year too. And that was a miserable tailgate. I don't know why we decided to be out there for as long as we did, but I think it was a fun season. It was a really fun atmosphere all season. And
I think we were worried about disrupting the karma.
Yeah.
Turned out the karma did not give a damn about any of us. So there we go. Anyway, if you missed our last episode, you should go back and listen to it. You should subscribe, by the way. We're on Spotify. We're on YouTube, on the Back Home Network. Check that out. We've got the whole roster of shows on the Back Home Network, but we've got our own channel on Spotify, on Apple, so you could subscribe to Football Weather there. Tell your friends about it. It's a brand new show. We've got a nice group of listeners now. I think over 100 subscribers now across the platforms in just the first couple of weeks of doing the show, which is really, really awesome. We really appreciate all you folks tuning in. Last episode, we walked through all the SEC teams that we thought were contenders based upon their schedule, went game by game. We did it again for the Big Ten, and we came up with some divergent answers on this, which I think is interesting. But we want to go through this process and kind of talk about the Big Ten generally, looking at the schedule, trying to figure out exactly what we should be expecting and who might be in the playoff picture at the end of the year. And that's really what this is all about, is the playoff picture, because we know we're going to have 12 teams, and we know that those 12 teams, at least 6 of them, maybe as many as 8 or 9, might end up coming from these 2 conferences. And so it'll probably only be like 7 or 8, but it could be 9. I wouldn't throw it out of the realm of possibility. So just to recap, going back to last time, we were fairly secure on there being 4 teams from the SEC that were going to be playoff contenders. We had largely had consensus on Georgia and Texas and Alabama. And then Matt thought Texas A&M was a good choice. I thought LSU was the best of the choices. Ole Miss was kind of sneaking around in that mix, but that's essentially what we landed on. Now with the Big Ten, we've got kind of a different set of circumstances here. And part of that is because of the schedule that the Big Ten is playing. And part of it is the way that the games have broken down in terms of who's playing who. And the first thing I'll note, just as a Matt, is that weirdly, and they didn't do this on purpose because these schedules were set a couple of years ago, but a lot of contenders don't play other contenders in the Big Ten, and it's set up a really fascinating scenario where you could have a bunch of teams with pretty good records by the end of the year and a couple of good wins apiece.
Yeah, I was going through it, and it's also on the opposite side too. The lower teams don't play each other either. So like we have this weird combo where I have a lot of teams in that 9-3, 10-2, up to 11-1, up to 11-1 range, but up to 6-3 in the conference and up, because there was just they play a lot of the lower teams that we're expecting to be lower, and they're not playing as much against each other. So yeah, so you're going to see a lot of records that are really good in the conference, but I think what's going to happen, at least what I notice here, is when you get down to it, it's really going to probably become down to strength of schedule a little bit this year, probably for the Big Ten in terms of like the bigger picture. But then breaking down who's in, specific bowl games, I have a pretty clear top two, I think, for who's going to be in Indianapolis. But in general, who's going to be in the mix for all the other spots is going to be interesting.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about it a little bit. So first of all, I wanted to talk about what our projected records were with both of our projections, because we looked at all of these. I think what was interesting is that by and large, we basically had 3 of our bottom 4 pretty consistent across the board. We both really don't like Purdue. We both picked them to go 0-9 in the conference and 2-10 overall. I mean, it could be another horrifically bad season for Purdue. Now, they could surprise. Barry Odom's not a bad coach by any means, but he just doesn't have a ton to work with. And they play a pretty tough schedule all the way around. Like, I think you could make an argument that Purdue, this is the most Purdue football talk you might get all season until the Bucky game, but they play Ball State and Southern Illinois to start, and then you go down their list, and the only other winnable game on their schedule might be at home versus Rutgers or at Northwestern, and those games are back-to-back. Yeah. Everything else looks like a bridge too far for them this season. I mean, even if they're better, it may not show.
Yeah, I mean, they're turning over their whole roster. They have one returning starter, so it's going to be a really tough road for them. Luckily, they have SIU at the beginning and Ball State, but those probably aren't where they're at right now. Those probably aren't gimmies in terms of the bottom teams. And Rutgers and Maryland, they're in the same boat. They don't really. They have a lot of tough road games too, and their home games are really tough too. And then I put Wisconsin down there at 1-8 in the conference and they may be a better than a 1-8 team and 3-9 overall. But I mean, they have maybe the toughest 10-game stretch or 8-game stretch maybe in college football, and they also play at Alabama early in the season. I mean, they go at Michigan, home against Iowa, home against Ohio State, at Oregon, and then home against Washington, at Indiana, home against Illinois, at Minnesota. I'm sure there's other schedules that are in that realm, but that has to be the hardest schedule in the Big Ten.
Yeah, I mean, I have Wisconsin going 4-8. And I have them winning 2 games in conference simply because Camp Randall Stadium is still a bit of a home field advantage. I mean, that's still a tough place to play. And I know it wasn't, they're not as good. And I don't know if this Luke Fickell experiment's really going to work. But last year, against a pretty tough schedule then, too, they had to play Alabama and Penn State and Oregon all at home. They still went 5-7 that season. Now, granted, the 3 wins they had in conference were Purdue, Rutgers, and Northwestern, but I think your scenario might be the more likely scenario of the 2. It's certainly possible. But Maryland, as I think, it's interesting because I expected when I went through this to say, Maryland might have a bounce back year. Their schedule is also very difficult, and when you've already admitted as a head coach that you've lost your locker room once, it's generally not a good harbinger of future events. And that's essentially what's happened to them in the lead up to this season. They look like they might be in trouble. And then Rutgers, Rutgers I keep reading that Rutgers is a team that might be on the precipice of things. They made a bowl last year. I had them at a very low record. I expected you as a Jersey native to have looked at their schedule and found more wins than I did, but we ended up with the same projected record.
Yeah, I know they went to a bowl game, and I know that there's an upswing here, but just the way the schedule broke for them, I have them, they're at Washington, home against Oregon, and then they probably have the toughest finish in the conference at Ohio State and home against Penn State. It's just going to be a really tough road for them. I just don't. They could certainly be better than 4-8, but they're just not going to. They don't have the opportunities. I mean, there's the 2 opportunities for them to win maybe games is Maryland at home and at Purdue, and maybe Iowa at home because Iowa's they just punt, right? But there's not I just don't see them getting this anywhere near 6. Maybe they get that 5th win, and maybe they beat Maryland as well. But I just don't see it this year. It's just gonna be a really tough road for them.
Yeah. So let's jump to the top of the conference, because that's what we really wanted to focus on. And what's interesting is Matt's got 2 teams that he feels like are going to be in the Big Ten title game. And it's Ohio State finishing in Matt's evaluation 8-1 and 10-2, and then Penn State at 8-1 and 11-1. So I'm curious what games you had them losing to get to that point. So just to recap for everybody, first and foremost, and maybe I'll just call it up here with my projections, just so people can see what we're looking at with these particular teams. Give me just 1 second for those of you who are watching along on YouTube or on Spotify. There, you can't see that particularly well. Let me zoom in a little bit for you. But if you go to Ohio State's schedule, you can see they've got Texas, who is starting the season off as the number 1 team in the country. Grambling, Ohio, all those games at home. And then at Washington, Minnesota at home, at Illinois, at Wisconsin, Penn State, at Purdue, UCLA, Rutgers, and Michigan State. So you had them going 10-2 and 8-1, which I did as well. What was the loss you had them suffering in conference? Because I'm assuming you had them losing to Texas as well.
Yeah, I have them losing to Texas. I just think Texas is more loaded up. I think they're more ready to go. I think Ohio State, that's a tough first game for a new quarterback. Everyone that's kind of a brand new, not a brand new roster. They're still 5-star players all over the place. I had them losing at Washington. I'm actually, and you'll see this later, I'm really high in Washington. I think that's going to be a tough game for them. And I really like Jed Fish. I really like what they're doing up there. So that's where I have that one conference loss. But then I have them obviously winning out the rest of the way. And I'm curious who you have them losing to, I guess.
I had them losing at Illinois.
Okay.
And look, Washington, I've gone back and forth on. I had Washington as high as 9 wins and as low as 6 wins. And I think, what did I end up settling with them on? I settled with them at 7-5. Just because, again, and you made a comment like this to me when I was talking to you about what I initially thought SEC or USC was going to do. I do need to see them do it, because I was a little bit off-put last year by how much Washington struggled away from home. And, so you, and just, we mentioned it, so we might as well talk about it right now. You had Washington and Oregon as your 2 teams that were 7-2 in conference, 10-2 overall. Before I get to them, real quickly, you have Ohio State beating Penn State. So that's Penn State's 1 loss. And then you have those 2 teams matching up in the Big Ten title game. Probably a relatively popular pick. Penn State, I do want to linger on for a minute, though, because if you look at Penn State's schedule, first of all, anybody that's criticizing IU with their non-conference schedule that isn't also criticizing Penn State, I just want to note, Penn State's non-conference schedule is home against Nevada, home against Florida International, and home against Villanova. Wow. That's rough. That is a weak schedule. And again, it just goes to show, if you wear the right uniforms, you can kind of get away with anything in college football, according to a lot of media members. But when you look at this Penn State team, there's a lot of pressure on them. So I had them losing 2 games in conference, 10-2, 7-2. I picked Iowa as the second game they would lose because, again, Iowa's such a weird mercurial team. They can go out and beat a top 5 team at home and then turn around and lose to a really poor team on the road. Last year they lost to Michigan State, and it was just like, what's going on? We thought Michigan State might be good, and then it turned out, no, that was just Iowa throwing an Iowa game up that they often do. But, Penn State, it feels like, of all of the contenders, might have the most favorable schedule, in that if you want to look at, Ohio State, at Ohio State's really tough. But they get to play Oregon at home, and that's a long trip for Oregon and not a particularly easy flight. I mean, there's a reason why there's no directs from Eugene to State College, right? They get Indiana at home, and Indiana's never beaten Penn State in Happy Valley. If you're going to play a quasi-contender on the road, you'd probably choose Iowa as the team you'd want to play. And then the rest of their games, at UCLA, Northwestern, at Michigan State, Nebraska, and at Rutgers all feel like games that they can handle relatively easily.
Yeah, their road trips seem to set up really well for them, where they are not playing the top, as you said, the top teams. Where the other game that I looked at, and I looked at the Iowa game too, and I just said I still feel I think the Penn State team is really good. They're returning a lot of pieces. They were really close to playing for the national championship last year. Really close. They're bringing a lot of folks back. They're the quarterback's back. As much as I don't really trust Franklin. He has the squad to do it this year. And if he doesn't do it this year, then never. But the other game I looked at was Indiana, because it's after that Ohio State game, and it's a huge letdown spot for them if they happen to win or lose that game. Either way, it's a spot for the Hoosiers to certainly capitalize on. But like you said, they've never beaten them. But just the way the schedule sets up, back to what we were talking about, their road trips are at UCLA right after the Oregon game. That's a game you potentially could look at, but I'm not really high on UCLA. We already talked about Iowa. Then they come off the bye at Ohio State after the Indiana game at Michigan State. They finish at Rutgers. So the road trips are manageable for them, and in terms of what their schedule is going to look like.
Yeah, I got the full thing here. So the nice thing is Oregon, the other team that we are talking about in this mix. So when I went through and did my breakdown, I had Oregon as one of the two teams that would play in the Big Ten title game alongside Ohio State. I also had Ohio State only losing once. I do wonder, Matt, if we are just accepting the idea that Oregon's just going to be that good, because they were clearly very good last year. They were the best regular season team. They were the number one seed. They won the Big Ten title game. They beat that Penn State team that you just mentioned, nearly made the college football playoff final on a neutral field. And then they got absolutely buzzsawed in the second round of the college football playoff by Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. They lose a lot off of that team. They lost, 17 starters, I think it was. Yep. And now Oregon doesn't have recruiting problems. They just bring in blue chippers left and right. But it might be asking a lot, and they could be a potential regression candidate, except their schedule outside of the trip to Penn State, Indiana at home, and at Washington. Again, I think they have a relatively favorable schedule as well. There are other games against what I would consider to be live competition. You got to go to Iowa, but they feel like a team that's uniquely suited to not be bothered by Iowa. They've got USC and Minnesota and Wisconsin all at home. They get to go to Northwestern, which is not that big of a deal. They get to go to Rutgers. They could stumble in some of these games, but it also, just on paper, you just get the sense that they could run through that schedule pretty easily.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. They are reloading, and I'm sure they have a chip on their shoulder after finishing the conference 13-0. They were the best team all year. They were the most complete team in 2024. And they probably having to play that game down at home probably wasn't helpful in having that long break. But they certainly got curb stomped against Ohio State. But that's Ohio State team was rolling. But yeah, you're right. In terms of the schedule, it works out really nicely for them. They do have a Power 5 or Power 4 conference game, Oklahoma State, but they were 0-9 last year in their conference, so maybe not the best one. And they play Oregon State, who's obviously is always going to be there for them to play because that's their rival. But you're right. I mean, the way it sets up, they play Penn State early, but really the backside of that conference schedule, it's sort of the middle part. After Indiana, you have Rutgers and you have Wisconsin at home, and even though they're bye, and then at Iowa. It certainly sets up that they should be in that 9-10 win mix regardless. It's just a matter of, I have them at 10. If they can get everything together, and like you said, when you have those 5-star prospects, it's a lot easier to reload. Ohio State's been doing it for 25 years.
So then let's move down to the next tier of teams. So two teams that we really need to look at, and you had both of these teams at 9-3 overall and 6-3 in conference. I'm talking about Indiana and Illinois. So we've talked a lot about Indiana on Crimson Cast. We'll talk a little bit about them here. It's a harder schedule than last year on paper, but then again, going into last year, the schedule looked like it might be more difficult on paper than it ended up being. Indiana, Illinois at home, at Iowa, at Oregon, at Penn State. Those are the 4 games that you would look at and say, well, those are the toughest ones. And the rest of it's fairly favorable. They get Michigan State and UCLA at home. They're at Maryland, and it's relatively late in the season, and Indiana should have more depth. They get Wisconsin at home, and then they're at Purdue to close the season because that's the rivalry game. So, they have a very, very easy non-conference schedule with Old Dominion, Kennesaw, and Indiana State. So really it feels like the season and the way the season will be judged could come down to the 4 games that I mentioned earlier. Obviously, Michigan State, UCLA, Wisconsin, those are games that you can't take lightly, but Indiana should win on paper. That Illinois game early is going to really dictate a lot of narratives as far as where the relative position of Indiana and Illinois happen to be in the Big Ten. At Oregon and at Penn State's a tall order. It doesn't feel completely insurmountable. And you had Indiana at 9-3. I had them at 10-2 and 7-2. It feels like 8-4 is just as much of a likelihood as like 10-2 or 11-1. And I don't really know which side to land on. It's really interesting because I could make an argument for Indiana to win every game on their schedule, but I could make an argument for them to lose like 4 of them.
Yeah, I mean the floor is those 4 games. I can't see them losing any more than 4 this year. I had Oregon, and I'm losing the Oregon game and the Penn State game. The other one I have Iowa, and it's just the Iowa sting from 2021 is still sitting there, and I just can't get over it. I just can't get over it yet. And I'm sure I'm hoping they win that game, but that's where I have their 3rd loss. And we saw them perform really well on the road last year, so it wouldn't be surprising if they were to win that game and be 10-2, be in the mix. But you're right, the schedule does seem, and on paper it does seem to be harder, but they do still have a nice schedule that breaks really well for them to at least be 8-4. But I would say they're probably going to be in that 9-3, 10-2 range.
So then Illinois, so they've got one quasi-challenging non-conference game. They're at Duke, and that's going to be an interesting challenge for them. And their schedule is interesting because they're at Indiana, they're at Washington, they have Ohio State at home, they have USC at home. Other than that, pretty manageable. But again, this is where with Illinois, I think there's been a lot. They're almost like the opposite of Oregon, where they have a bunch of people back. They had a pretty good year last year. And the idea is, they're all going to get progressively better. I had them losing at Indiana and at Washington, but I had them beating Ohio State, beating USC to land at 10-2. What did you have their 3 losses as?
Yeah, I have the IU game and the Washington game as well. I also have Ohio State. I feel at that point Ohio State will probably be rolling after a slow start for Ohio State. I just feel that game breaks really well for them after they really kind of face that early schedule that Ohio State has. I'm trying to pull it up real quick. Ohio State, when they play Texas, Grambling, Ohio, then they get at Washington, Minnesota, and then at Illinois. I feel like they'll really start to get going in that second part of their schedule. And really, like Ohio State has rarely in the history of the in the Big Ten or in their lifetime have lost more than 4 games, have won less than 8. So you have to figure that they're going to be in the mix just like they always are. And that's a tough game. We haven't seen Ryan Day lose a game like that, and the only game he's really ever lost like that's to Michigan. But he's never really lost a conference game that of any consequence to any of these other schools. So until that happens, again, I'm looking at looking historically here. I still like Illinois to go 9-3, but I can certainly see them maybe getting that 10-2. I don't know where the 4th loss comes from unless it's USC at home.
So when we think about the other teams that are kind of in the mix right now, there's a couple. So when I look at what I came up with in terms of the game by game, I've mentioned most of the top ones, but I think this is where we have to bring in conversation about Michigan, USC, Nebraska, and Minnesota, who feel like the teams that might have the opportunity to contend. And as it turns out, you had those as your cluster of teams that were kind of in the upper half of the Big Ten, same as I did. So I feel like we kind of got to the same answer. So let's kind of break through those individually. Let's start with Michigan, who's ranked in the top 15 in the coaches poll. They'll probably be ranked just as high in the AP poll. They didn't have a great season last year, although they had a great ending to the season, but a lot of slop prior to that. They're starting a true freshman quarterback, and I think have a coach that's still not really proven that he can win consistently. We've seen first-year coaches riding on the vapors of the prior regime do well, and we don't know. Sherrone Moore may be a really good coach. He may not be. It's an odd schedule for Michigan in that if you look at it, I can see why a lot of people think that they could finish this season ranked in the top 10, but I could also see a lot of potential stumbles. And again, this was a team that almost had to get a little bit lucky at times to get to the final record that they had last year. You know, they only beat Southern Cal at home, or USC, sorry for my LA crowd. They only beat USC by 3 at home. They only beat Minnesota by 3 at home. They only beat Michigan State, who was not good last year, by 7 at home. And, you know, it feels like they were kind of walking that line where those games could have gone the other way, and you could have potentially been talking about a team that didn't even make a bowl. It seems like a big leap for them with a freshman quarterback to just assume that they're going to want to win a bunch of these games on their schedule this year.
Yeah, I had them at, what did you have them? I 8-4 and then 5-4 overall. I did go back and forth in the Oklahoma game because it is at Oklahoma, but those two teams are very. I'm not even sure what to make of Oklahoma. You know, and Michigan, like you said, they're starting a freshman quarterback, so it's gonna be really interesting to see him going into Norman, and obviously playing really well in his second career game. And don't forget, I think Sherman Moore is suspended for that first game, so his first game of the year will be that Oklahoma game. But yeah, their schedule it's not impossible, but they do have a lot of landmines there. They're at Nebraska, who we both projected to be a lot better than the last couple of years. At USC, they go. They obviously have Washington at home, and they play the school down south for the last game of the year. So it's a tricky schedule, but I can certainly see where the optimism is based off how they finished last year. Obviously, they played really well against IU. They beat Ohio State. They played well in the bowl game, so they have some momentum coming into this year. But it's all going to be dependent on that quarterback. Yeah. And they play the game in the trenches like than any other team in the country. So it's certainly going to have to be that type of ball to get that quarterback comfortable for a big time run this season.
Let's talk about Nebraska next. And this Nebraska team, everybody's been waiting on them. The great things were supposed to happen last year. They didn't really happen last year. They had a very uneven season, I think, to put it mildly. And it wasn't the worst season that we've seen out of Nebraska. They finished the season 7-6. They beat Boston College in the bowl game. But they largely beat up on bad teams in the conference. They did beat Colorado, but Colorado wasn't very good, as we found out in the non-conference. They kept it close against Illinois, which to me cast more doubt on Illinois than anything else. And then the wins in the conference were Rutgers at home, UCLA at home. Sorry, they lost that game to UCLA. Sorry, Wisconsin at home. And then they beat Purdue on the road. So that was their 3 wins: Purdue, Rutgers, and Wisconsin. Not a lot there for optimism, but you look at their schedule this year, it's a pretty easy pathway in the non-conference. Cincinnati can occasionally be frisky, but I don't think this year's team has much of a chance. So they'll start off with 3 wins like they did last year. And the question is Matt Rule elevated them to the point where they can start winning some games? And I had them at 8-4 and 5-4, but I could have, that's with them beating Michigan at home and beating Iowa at home, and then losing at Minnesota, at UCLA, at Penn State, and at home versus USC. That felt reasonable to me. And maybe you could swap out, maybe they lose to Michigan, but they're able to beat, I don't know, UCLA on the road or something like that. You had them actually 1 game better than I did. Are you optimistic about them this year?
Yeah, I mean, if they get past that Michigan game, they're going to they have a good chance of starting 6-0 going into that Minnesota game at Minnesota. So there's a really good shot for Matt Rule to get this team off to. Well, they have had some good starts and they just kind of fumbled towards the end. I have them actually losing at Minnesota, but actually have them beating USC and losing at UCLA, and that's just based on that schedule. I mean, they're going to play 6 straight weeks, and the last game is on the road on the other side of the country. I guess not on the other side for them, but far enough on the other side of the country. And then I have them losing at Penn State and then winning at Iowa. So I have them finishing 9-3, but I don't think they're going to have a playoff resume because they're not going to have that big win that's going to get them in. Because I don't see Michigan elevating them enough to get them in the mix. It's kind of like with Illinois. Illinois had the same. They played a tough schedule, but all their wins were against the lower tier of the conference. They weren't against those top 3. So they're in that same boat for me. I do think Nebraska does take the next step. I really do like Matt Rule. I think he has taken that program to the next level, and I think they'll finally be somewhat Nebraska after 25 years here, at least maybe moving in that direction.
Minnesota, who's right next to them on the list, again, not a great non-con, although they do play at Cal. Although Cal's lost a ton this offseason. Man, that's a rough go for Cal. But, Minnesota has been a team under PJ Fleck that has consistently been in the conversation. They had that 1 year where they went 10-2 and made a New Year's Six Bowl. Last year, they had a very typical Minnesota season in that they pulled a couple of wins off that maybe you didn't expect. They beat USC at home. They beat Wisconsin on the road at the end of the season. They beat Illinois at Illinois, which was a game that really kind of derailed Illinois' playoff chances.
Yeah.
And they had Penn State on the ropes. I'm still very bitter about that game. I've mentioned it, I think, in every college football podcast that I've done, where all they do is they close that game out. Indiana's in the Big Ten title game, and Penn State maybe doesn't even make the playoff.
Yeah.
So they're 8-5 last year. This year, I had them at 8-4 in my projections, and it's a very similar kind of thing where it looks like, Rutgers at home, Purdue at home. I really like them in those two. I like them against Nebraska at home. I like them at Northwestern. I like them against Wisconsin. But then their other 4 games are at Ohio State, at Iowa, Michigan State at home, which they always have one game where they just completely slip on a banana peel. That was my random pick for that game for them. And then at Oregon. It feels like the 3 road games there are not games that Minnesota's going to win.
Yeah.
And then, maybe it's not Michigan State. Maybe they lose at home to Wisconsin or whatever. But I feel like, again, they'll be a good but not contending team in terms of the playoff.
Yeah, because 3 of their 4 toughest games are on the road, as you mentioned. I actually have the same exact 8-4 as you do. Same 4 losses. The same 4 losses. But I was thinking of that graphic or that meme that someone posted of Texas A&M with the 8-4 next to their letters.
Yep,
that's what I think about Minnesota, because they have consistently been like 7-5, 8-4 under Fleck, and it's for Minnesota football historically, and it's great. Like that's probably where they should be, with an occasional bump to when they had that 10-2 season. Yep. They feel like they will be in that same range they've been, 8 wins. If they can pick one off, maybe they get to 9. But again, they're gonna have to win all the games we just discussed, or win maybe 2 of those, Ohio State, Iowa, or Oregon, to have a shot, because the rest of the schedule does not break. I don't see California rising up and being a power in the ACC. Almost said Pac-12, but the ACC. So really, their schedule looks really, really, really brutal for them to contend, even if they got to 9-3.
Yeah. Last team we'll talk about, and then we'll wrap things up, is USC. This is the ultimate kind of show me team, which you communicated to me via text, and it's true in that we need to see USC actually do something in the Big Ten. They've had diminishing returns this first year, and it just kind of looks like one of those schedules where there's a lot of landmines that they're going to have to avoid stepping on. Their non-conference is Missouri State, Georgia Southern, no problems there, but they got to go to Notre Dame, and it felt like they could have beaten Notre Dame at home last year, and they just didn't bring their A game in that game. And Notre Dame deservedly won, but it did feel like going into the game that USC might have been able to contend. They've got to go to Illinois. They got to go to Nebraska. They got to go to Oregon. They've got Michigan at home. They've got Michigan State at home, Iowa at home, UCLA at home. And when I look at their schedule, I think I had them at 9-3. I originally had them at 10-2, and I ended up backing them off of a win. I think I ended up reclassifying. I thought, oh, you know what? This is the team that knocks off Oregon. And then I was like, no, I'm being foolish. I think Oregon's, good enough. They'll be better than USC, especially at that time of the season. You had them, I think, 1 game under at 8-4, but it kind of feels like we're feeling similar vibes on this team right now.
Yeah, they lost a lot of close games. We talked about this. They lost at Michigan. They should have never lost. They lost it was at Minnesota as well. They should have probably been 2 games better. They just had a lot of really wonky losses. And who knows? Maybe they'll get that corrected.
They lost at home to Penn State by 3. If you recall, that was a game they were right in it, and that was the thing with them. Their biggest wonkiest loss we didn't even mention was the game at Maryland that they lost 29-28.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and they also lost at Washington. I remember listening to that game on the radio driving back from. I think I was actually driving back from the No, that was a different game. I was driving back from something. I listened to some game driving back from Indiana Northwestern, and it was a lot of fun. Oh, I did listen. I was driving back from Indiana Michigan State. That's where I was listening to that game.
Yeah.
But yeah, they had a ton of games, and even their wins. Like, you look down last year, the close ones. I mean, obviously they beat Wisconsin and Rutgers pretty handily, but they only beat UCLA by 6. They only beat Nebraska at home by 8. Like, they were a team that was in games, but they were not a particularly good team in those types of games. And for USC to go 6-6 in the regular season just felt like, well, gosh, is this the new normal? It's kind of like, are they the new Nebraska of the Big Ten if Nebraska is no longer going to be the Nebraska of the last decade and a half?
Right. And, it's one of those things. It's like they're maybe the one school, or multiple. I think there was a stat midway through the year, right, where the teams playing on the West Coast going east 2 or 3 time zones were like 1-18 at one point. I don't know what the final record ended up, but USC was part of the issue. USC was losing a lot of those games.
Yeah.
And again, that's the one thing that it's, I know I've talked about it a lot, but it has seemed to matter for those schools that have come east, especially for USC. We saw with Washington last year here when they played IU. Those noon games get a little trickier, or the Friday night games, and they've complained about them. But until we know more later, some of those games may end up at the same time. So USC certainly has the ability to go 10-2. I don't think either of us disagree with that. They've recruited better. Lincoln Riley's a great coach.
They have a ton of talent, and yet
they've been in this spot now. I know they had Caleb a couple of years ago, but Lincoln Riley's never recruited a defense in his 7 years as head coach with Oklahoma and now USC. Yeah. So can he take this team to the next level and get into the playoff discussion? I guess we'll see. But like you said, until it's one of those things, until I see him do it, see him come to the Big Ten for a second year, maybe figure out some of the things that he's had to learn. And that Notre Dame game being in that spot, I know we've talked about that too with Notre Dame and playing Notre Dame still. It's in a weird spot of the schedule too, where it's right after Michigan, I believe.
Yeah, it's the sequence for them: Michigan at home, at Illinois, Michigan State at home, at Notre Dame, at Nebraska. It's a tough combination of games right in the middle of the season. I mean, that's games 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 for them.
Yeah, and they have 2 byes right in between. They have a weird bye situation for how their schedule sets up. Anyway, USC should be a contender, you would think, this year. It doesn't make any sense why they aren't. But for them, it's really getting off the mats. They should go 4-0 into that Illinois game. And at least for them, Illinois is going to be coming off an Indiana game, so maybe that's where USC can pick one off.
Yeah. So when I look at these, I think from my perspective, it feels pretty clear that unless there's a real collapse due to just the team not gelling, in both of these teams' cases, I think both Oregon and Ohio State feel like pretty surefire bets as college football playoff, not just contenders, but likely teams to get in. And then when I look at that next group of teams, for me, I would say the winner of the Indiana-Illinois game early in the season should have an inside track as long as they only lose 2 games the rest of the way.
Yep.
And I would also say that Penn State, as you said, will probably be right there and will likely get the benefit of the doubt because they're starting so high in the polls. And because, the 2 losses that I had Penn State suffering in this would be at Ohio State, which they wouldn't get penalized for at all, and at Iowa, which I think as long as Iowa finishes with 7 or 8 wins, which I think is entirely possible, they're not going to get punished for that either if they even lose that game. To me, if the Big Ten gets 4 teams in the playoff, it's 4 coming out of that group of 5. I wouldn't be surprised if you had a Washington or a USC or a Michigan sneaking up and taking one of those teams' places in the mix. But given the schedule and the way that things are set up, I think that the best chance for 4 playoff teams comes out of that cluster of 5: Oregon, Ohio State, Indiana, Penn State, Illinois.
Yeah, and I did have Washington in the mix. I think I was the one that was different. I did Washington in the mix too. So yeah, certainly. And we're not going to run into a situation which we ran into last year with the Big Ten, where it was the 4 schools and everybody else. There was nobody past those top 4 schools. We're going to have those top 2, and then maybe a group of the 5 or 6 you mentioned, which will make for an interesting conference race. And then with the SEC, we had 6 teams as well. So we're thinking we're probably going to have 7 or 8 teams from that group that are going to be in the 12-team playoff. So it's really going to be coming down who you lose to, and those teams that are in that middle, like you said, Illinois or Indiana, or let's say Nebraska, 9-3, holding serve and not losing those games to, say, Purdue, Maryland, all those can't happen for those teams to be in the mix.
Well, and what I also tried to do was think about, all right, any team I am putting forward as a potential playoff team is going to have at least one signature win against another team in contention.
Yeah.
And in this case, Illinois would have a win against Ohio State. Indiana would have a win against Illinois. Penn State would have, at least in my projections, a win against Oregon and a win against Indiana. Oregon would have a win against Indiana. It's funny how Indiana becomes like the team that you're putting forward. Oregon might be the one, I will say, if you look at their schedule, they're at Penn State, they have Indiana at home, and then this is where Washington kind of has to be really good for them to get credit for, are they just going to get credit for beating Indiana and that's it? But the thing is, Washington is at Washington, and that is a series that Washington has done really well in over the course of the last several years. Yeah. So I think that's going to be interesting. And then Ohio State obviously would have a win against Penn State, would have a win at Washington. This is where it's going to be fascinating, because the same kind of cannibalization people talk about in the SEC happens here too. But I think, unlike the SEC, you might have a situation where everybody picks up at least a couple of good wins, and that could make the selection process really complicated.
Yeah, you're right. And, I was just thinking about this there. If you mentioned Oregon schedule, like if things don't break right or they lose those 2 games, they're in trouble. But one team that may hold the cards of all of this is Iowa, because they play Indiana, Penn State, Minnesota, Oregon, USC, and Nebraska, all teams that we projected to have 9 or 8 wins or maybe even 10 wins, right? So Iowa almost needs to pick off one of those teams so they finish in that 7-5, 8-4 region to help boost up those other teams. Something like I just said earlier, the Big Ten didn't have last year. They didn't have that 5th team boosting everybody up.
Right. And I think there's a real possibility they could have 6 or 7 teams where, if Michigan, who we didn't mention in this mix, Michigan could be in the mix. If Michigan finishes with 9 wins, if Iowa finishes with 8 or 9 wins, if Minnesota finishes with 9 wins, like now, you avoid what you had last year, which is the middle and the bottom of the Big Ten looking further away. And this is where I think it's going to be fascinating as the polls come out and the way that these teams are treated and how they get off to a start. Like, it would be, I think, as much as people in Indiana circles have wanted to see Illinois knock down a couple of notches, it's like you want Illinois to win at Duke. You want to pick up a nice non-conference win early on because there aren't a whole lot of opportunities. You want Iowa to win at Iowa State, which has been very difficult for them to do. Yep. You want Michigan to win at Oklahoma, I think, for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
Ohio State, Texas is really going to be a fascinating one. That's a game I have Texas beating Ohio State in. That may not be a good projection. We don't really know. Yeah. What that Texas team is going to do, because they lost quite a bit, including their starting quarterback from last year. So there's things like that I think if you're looking for the Big Ten, if you're a Big Ten supporter and you want to get more teams in, the teams really do need to make some hay early on. It'd be great for the conference if Nebraska's ranked, if Minnesota gets ranked, if you can get some of those teams up into the midst, because it's going to be, there's enough good games against competition that is going to be contending teams that they're going to knock each other out to some degree as you move forward without that.
Yeah, and those games that out of conference games that are, it's far and few between. Just the way the Big Ten, they play the 9 conference games. And maybe Wisconsin can walk into Tuscaloosa and win that game. Maybe no.
I'll tell you, if that happened, the SEC might just not enter the college football playoff. They might just go do their own thing at that. That would be hilarious.
They may go to 7 conference games at that point or something, so they can play other games. But yeah, I mean that one, and honestly, the USC Notre Dame game matters too. Notre Dame's schedule is not very.
That was the game I had USC winning initially, and then I backed off and had Notre Dame winning it. But it's the other thing about the playoff, which is that Notre Dame being good enough that they take a playoff spot throws everything into even greater confusion. And that's one of those games that Notre Dame will get a lot of credit for. and rightfully so. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but that's the kind of game for the good of the Big Ten that you really want USC to go in and pick up the victory, because if you can knock Notre Dame down a peg, maybe it opens up a spot for another Big Ten team. Maybe USC, maybe somebody else.
Well, yeah, and the top 25. I'm just looking at it. The coaches poll of their day. The Big 12 had Arizona State, SMU, and that's it. Iowa State, that's it. Oh, Texas Tech. Sorry, so 4 teams, and then the ACC had Miami and Clemson
and SMU.
SMU's I have the wrong conference. So 3 schools. Right in the ACC,
I think that's right. Well, actually, the Big 12's got a couple more, I think, because it's BYU, Texas, BYU, Texas Tech, Kansas State. It's so hard. It's like, oh, BYU, the Mountain West has a team. No, they don't. Look, a lot of it early on. I think if you're the Big Ten, you're looking at it, and it's like, well, you like the fact that you've got Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon all in the top 10. You've got Illinois, Michigan, Indiana all in the top 20. You'd like to have Nebraska or USC or whatever in there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens the first few weeks.
Yep.
Because it's hard to break into that poll. As Indiana found out, if you don't start in the poll and you're also not playing a ton of teams early on that move the needle.
Right. And, we saw this with the Big 12 this year, not even doing a preseason poll because Arizona State was dead last year, right? So you're right. So those teams that aren't even in there need to play really well early, even though Indiana played really great early last year. They didn't break into the 4th or 5th week. But if you're a Big Ten fan and you're like, we obviously want to get 4 playoff teams, maybe 5 if everything breaks right. You're a big Clemson fan, and then you're a fan of chaos in the Big 12. That's what you're fans of, because that's what you need. Those 2 conferences to get 1 bid. The Group of 5 has 1, so that's 3, and then you're down to Notre Dame and the Big Ten SEC.
Going to be fascinating. See what happens. Anyway, we'll wrap this episode up. Next episode, we will dive into the other 2 power conferences, the ACC and the Big 12. We'll talk about what we're seeing in those 2 conferences, how they meter out, where they might factor into the playoff, as we continue on with our season previews here on Football Weather for Matt Blaska. I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll catch you on the flip side. So long, everybody.